12205 Imperial Avenue, Cleveland, Ohio, being torn down.
Amen! Hallelujah! Tear down! Tear down! Tear down!
Officially, it's become a risk to the public health. But as it's wiped away from the world, demolition teams cannot remove the memories of what has gone on inside. Those who did manage to escape the horrors of 12205 tell of macabre discoveries.
She caught a glimpse of one of the decomposing bodies, which frightened her and just made her, realize, I have got to get out of here.
Another victim enters 12205 with a man she thinks charming.
He raped her and made her repeat after him, "Yes, sir, I like it." He was as frightening an attack as can be imagined by any woman.
Others escape by throwing themselves from the upper floor windows of a house full of pain, not knowing if they'll survive. A passerby calls police.
She fell out the window upstairs on the second floor.
Okay, are you there?
And she laying on the ground, butt neck.
Are you with her right now?
I'm right here right now. She laying on the ground, butt neck.
He rapes, he binds, he murders. He rapes, he binds, he murders.
Each time Sowell entices a woman into his home, whether they live or die, is up to him. How many times will he rape? How many times will he murder? Before anyone can get inside the mind of a serial killer. Mount Pleasant, Cleveland, Ohio. Its name belies what a dangerous neighborhood it can be. Between 2007 and 2009, it proves all too treacherous for women walking the streets alone. Anthony Sowell claims to be hearing voices telling him to kill.
I think I choke. Nothing like beat,
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
No.
What they were like off or something maybe? Or what? What do you think would cause you to choke her? I mean, just off the top of your head. Think about it. Punish her?
My girl and them something. That's all I can say.
That was punishing them because of...
I was the punish. Like,
was the punish?
I can't explain it.
When women meet Anthony Sowell, they think he's a good guy, someone with whom to party.
Well, I think if you look at the MO that Anthony Sowell used, a lot of the women actually went willingly to his home.
And those women had gone to Anthony Sowell's house maybe to use drugs or drink or just hang out with him and had never left the home.
A very specific demographic was in danger. Using his bare hands, Sowell becomes a one-man lethal weapon.
He had a body that was right here. He had a body that was over here. He had a bag. There was a body in there. Oh my God. Hold on, look, I ain't finished. And he got a body behind the wall. Okay. Well, a lot of dirt back there, too. A lot of dirt all over that body.
Inside his killing chambers, Anthony Sowell displays the two sides to his personality. When his life is surrounded by order, discipline, routine, he's a regular guy. When he's out of work, down on his luck, he turns to drink and drugs. And then things can get very ugly.
On October 29th, 2009, some Cleveland police officers, some detectives actually went to Anthony Sowell's home on Imperial Avenue, and they were looking to arrest him. A woman had accused him of rape. When they went to the house, he was not there.
The streets Sowell cruises, as police call it his house, are home to a lot of women whose lives have been captured by drugs. Around the time that Sowell stalks the neighborhood for women, decades of economic distress and home foreclosures placed him in a world of failure, decay, disorder, drugs too, and drink, lots of drink.
There was a little corner store right there that was kind of the hub of activity on Imperial Avenue. They were really familiar with Anthony Sowell. He would come in and buy, tall beers, King Cobra beers, which he would drink often. People would come over to the store when they would come to his house, buy beer, party, kind of back and forth.
A cocktail of factors turns Sowell into a monster, one who escapes justice for 2 years. That late October day, the Cleveland police finally decide that events surrounding Sowell and 12205 Imperial need further investigation.
They entered the home and they found the bodies of 2 women who were basically sitting out in the open, decomposing. Once they found that, they called in a lot more police and some crime scene investigators. And over the course of maybe a week or more, they found many more bodies.
After digging in the backyard, investigators found 3 more bodies and the remains of a 4th.
There was bodies everywhere and crawl spaces on the floor. He's surrounded by his handiwork everywhere he turns.
One woman, really all they found of her was a skull that was in a bucket under some stairs in the basement. It turns out that there was 11 women total who had gone missing since about 2007.
Over 2 years, Anthony Sowell had somehow managed to lure the women into his home, rape them, torture them, kill them, leave their rotting bodies to decompose all around him, creating an unspeakable stench. And nobody knew. What, or who, made Anthony Sowell into the so-called Cleveland Strangler?
So many people could have seen this, but they didn't. The army thought he was great, prison wardens thought he was great, neighbors thought he was a lovely guy.
Sowell himself says his first taste of violence came when he was a child sharing a home in East Cleveland. He was not a happy boy.
Anthony Sowell was a timid, somewhat taunted boy.
He wasn't a person that everybody immediately had a specific memory of, but he was kind of always in the background, maybe a little bit socially awkward.
He grew up with a lack not only of a father figure, but a lot of very strong maternal figures. He had his mom, he had his grandmother, he had cousins of different ages, he had his 2 sisters.
The mother and the grandmother often would beat the children, that Sowell got beaten a lot.
She would beat them with an electrical cord to the point that they bled.
Sowell never presented recollections of his childhood to investigators. He raised them in court much later. By then, an independent source had come forward to offer an alternative memory of life in the Sowell household when he was a child. He wasn't always the victim. He was also the perpetrator.
One of his female cousins has reported that from the age of 11, she was continually raped by Anthony.
One relative testified during the trial that Sowell and other men in that house had sexually abused her from a very young age.
That may have had an influence on how he sees women and his sense of entitlement to have sex with those women, which was very clear from his interaction with some of his victims that survived.
When he leaves school, Sowell joins up. Leaving the chaos of East Cleveland and his abusive family environment behind, he settles into a routine. Military life suits him.
Maybe the stringent rules in the military were good for him for a while. I know that he was able to, cope in the military, do his job.
How long were you in the service?
7 years.
7 years?
You realistic?
You like you've been in the Marine Corps?
I'm good at it.
Yeah.
It's during this time as well, towards the end of his time as a Marine, that he begins to drink and drink quite extensively.
And in fact, at one point in the military, he married a woman who, she actually died, but her mother said that she had married Anthony because she kind of felt bad for him and she wanted him to be able to complete his time in the military, and she was able to help him keep on track.
But on leaving the military, it all begins to go wrong. It is 1989 when the seeds are sown for the shocking tragedy of 12205 Imperial. 2 things have changed in the Mount Pleasant neighborhood by the time Sowell returns from the Marines.
I think he came home to an East Cleveland that had actually declined even more than when he had left. The city was kind of getting poorer. There was the crack epidemic was really starting to affect the streets. There was a lot of mothers and fathers starting to use those drugs.
Meanwhile, women who'd previously led respectable lives began roaming the streets looking for ways of getting high, vulnerable to abuse. And Anthony Sowell himself was soon finding it hard to pass a liquor store.
2007, though, he fell apart. His girlfriend left him and he failed to show up for work. In the end, he was fired and he started to scavenge the streets for metal to sell as scrap. Inevitably, he returned to his crack cocaine habit.
He was really the kind of guy that was doing a lot of drinking. He'd go to the store in the morning and get a beer and just kind of continue that throughout the day.
A pattern is set. The drunk Sowell would home in on vulnerable women and use his charm to entice them back to his place.
It wasn't long that he was home before he was actually accused of harming several women. And actually two in kind of close proximity. There was two women, both of whom were pregnant, but also, you know, either abusing drugs or hanging out with people who were drinking, that Anthony Sowell was accused of raping.
This lady was heavily pregnant when she turned up to Sowell's house. And after spending some time together, she told him she was leaving. But he wouldn't let her go. He grabbed her and he began to choke her.
He was never prosecuted for that case because he was actually arrested for another case, another rape, within the same year. And he was prosecuted in that case. He ended up pleading guilty to attempted rape and was given a sentence of up to 15 years in prison.
He was released in 2005 to an East Cleveland still suffering from a drugs epidemic. He moved into the family property, 12205 Imperial Avenue. Today, where 12205 stood is a vacant lot, and locals like it that way. If its walls could tell a story, it would be one of human misery, of the last moments, the dying breaths of sisters, mothers, daughters. Crystal Dozier was described by her mother as the responsible one of her children, before she became addicted to crack cocaine. She could be found wandering the streets of Mount Pleasant. On May 17, 2007, by now a mother of 7 and aged 35, she went out to score drugs. She comes across Anthony Sowell. He had his flirting patter off to a T.
He would say, hey, do you want to come in and have a drink? And his house was a place where he would let people crash if they were using drugs and didn't want to go home. The house, you could tell, it was definitely used for a place where people could just crash and could just party. There's beer bottles or beer cans all around.
Crystal is in a daze as she hears him. Dreamily, she enters 12205. It looks ordinary enough. Sowell has raped before. He has never killed. But the motive and the method of killing for the first time is always lurking deep inside the mind of a serial killer. Will Crystal Dozier realize in time that she might die at any moment? Crystal Dozier is one of many women in Mount Pleasant, Cleveland, who's been captured by drugs and spotted by Anthony Sowell, lured into 12205 Imperial.
They were all had these vulnerabilities that Anthony Sowell appeared to hone in on.
As Crystal walks towards the porch of 12205, Sowell may have guessed she'd had a troubled life. Pregnant at 13, a mother of 2 by 17, of 7 by her mid-20s. Hers was now a transient world of drugs and drink. To her, Sowell means the chance of another hit, another high. She responds when he approaches her. Why wouldn't she?
So I looked at her, and she looked so sad and pitiful, like she just had a rough time or something. So I said, a beer? I said, how you gonna get a beer? I said, it's closed. Oh, they'll open up or something like that. Okay. So I said, I'll tell you what, come on with me, and you can get all the beers you want.
So you can imagine she meets him, he seems charming enough and persuasive enough that she decides, you know what, I'll go to this person's house. So any apprehension is clearly not big enough to stop her.
They didn't recognise him or see him as a potential risk.
And then she gets there, And that's where things begin to change. So any facade that he's been wearing of being nice or of being normal and caring, that all goes by the wayside. And that's when the terror sets in, because his tools are there. The tools to bind, the tools to hurt, and ultimately the tools to kill.
The woman had been drinking with Sowell when he actually just leapt on her. He began to strangle her. He shouted loudly what he was going to do to her, threatening the most appalling sexual attacks.
From what detectives could learn later from those who'd escaped the Sowell ordeal, it's likely he carried out his threat and raped Crystal. Sowell, in command, the master of events.
Rape is not about sex. Rape is all about control. Rape is about abuse and overpowering and hurting and controlling.
Strangulation is a very intimate kind of killing. It allows the offender to feel the person's life slip away from them. So it's a very intimate way of killing someone, but it also is the ultimate expression of power and control over someone.
He buried her body by the backyard fence of 12205. Family members searched for her throughout the time she was missing, still clinging on to the hope that she was alive. In fact, she had become victim number 1 of Anthony Sowell. Around that time, 2007, Sowell, a registered sex offender, would regularly receive visits at 12205 from the authorities, but they seldom entered. He seemed to be okay. The word was that prison had changed him. One of the bitter ironies about the Sowell story is that he responded well to discipline.
The indication is that during his prison sentence, he was a model prisoner.
He listened, he followed orders, directions, never really got in a lot of trouble.
And that's not surprising, because it gave him back that sense of structure and routine that he obviously had in the military and was missing when he came into civilian life.
He participated in Alcoholics Anonymous, so he was aware that he had an alcohol problem.
He's able to appear very lucid, very normal.
It was that ability to seem normal, like a regular guy, which would mean that the murder of Crystal Dozier inside his house was only the start of Sowell's killing career. Struggling women would go missing from the neighborhood, but throughout that time, Sowell relentlessly attracted women back to 12205, whilst police did nothing.
You know, their loved ones that they did love would go missing, but they would always call after a day or two. They would always come back. They would never miss important events like birthdays or Christmas. And so when they went missing for a longer period of time and didn't show up, a lot of them contacted the police and said, you know, this is different. And we're basically told, you know, hey, they'll come back when they're done using drugs.
As is the case with many serial killers, they go for the most vulnerable in our society.
So the police were dismissive of these women for the same reason that Anthony Sowell likely targeted them.
They're an easy target. They're easy, they're not missed, and this is precisely what he does.
I think he probably knew that people weren't going to come, you know, beating down his door looking for these women.
Tishana Culver fitted that precise profile when she went missing in June 2008, drifting in and out of family life. They didn't report her disappearance. There seemed little point as the 33-year-old had gone missing so often. Latundra Long was just 17, the youngest of Sowell's victims, but a mother of 3 when she went missing. Her life was in a mess. Deemed unfit to raise her children, she was seldom in contact with family members who loved her and who would one day receive horrific news.
One family, I think it was Latundra Long, the only thing they really recovered of her body was her head. And it was in a bucket in the basement, which was very difficult for them. They didn't even have a body to bury.
I know one thing I think always made me mad is they had kids in it.
And they was out in the street.
Yeah. Okay. That's a big thing in my head.
Tonya Carmichael was another who'd been in prison for drugs offences.
Her life kind of intersected with Sowell's early on. They both grew up on Page Avenue. You know, she knew him, you know, probably tangentially. The families kind of knew each other.
Every female that you have brought to the house, Have each and every one of them used drugs or are using drugs like crack or whatever? Okay. Is that one of the reasons why they come to your house? So they can smoke? Okay. And you telling me that you don't do that?
I
used to, but you don't do that.
Sometimes, but it ain't.
But then I'm trying to get the type of women that come to your house. And this is the type of women that come to your house are one drug users. Outright drug users.
Pretty sure. Okay.
Did you like them though? Did you like them when you met them?
Yes.
Okay. So you weren't mad at them when you met them. You kind of liked them all, right?
Yes.
Okay.
On the day Tonya disappeared, she had told friends that she was running an errand. She never returned. Later, her car would be found in Sowell's neighborhood. Much loved, her family knew things were wrong when she failed to return to pick up 2 paychecks.
When she initially went missing, her family went to police and they were asking for help to find her. And the police said, well, we know she has a drug problem. She'll come home when she's done using drugs. And this family really, they put up flyers. They were really searching for her, especially her daughter, Danita Carmichael, really cared for her mom deeply and was searching for her. And so this was really difficult for her.
15 months after claiming his first victim, Anthony Sowell killed 3 more times, and nobody suspects him of a thing, which means that the man who would become known as the Cleveland Strangler is still at large. The police even received more reports about him.
2 or 3 other women had made reports that mentioned him. There was one woman in particular, Gladys Wade, who in December 2008 said that Sowell approached her. She was walking past his house and tried to drag her in and attack her, and she fought him off. And when she reported her crime to the police, they found that she wasn't credible. And so after arresting him, they let him go.
Released to prey on people like Michelle Mason. Michelle was in a rare moment of happiness in her life. Thought to have kicked her heroin and crack cocaine habit, she was finally living independently. But on one October evening, she seems to have entered the home of Anthony Sowell without suspecting. What was going on inside the mind of a serial killer? What happened to Michelle Mason? At 45, she had fallen victim to drugs like Sowell's other victims. It's likely that she got the Anthony Sowell strangulation treatment at 12205.
There was a number of women who actually made it out of Anthony Sowell's house, and each of them also described either being choked or strangled by him quite aggressively, sometimes with like a cord or a strap, other times with his hands.
He treated them very roughly, he raped them, and he abused them verbally and physically.
I got mad and I was like, cussed him out and told him to get out of town.
So in your dream, you do remember getting mad?
I think so.
Do you ever remember doing anything with your hands? Actually doing stuff?
Yes, must, because I remember that.
Can you tell me exactly what did you do with your hands?
I can. That's why I could tell you there wasn't no weapon.
Michelle's body would become one of those found at 12205 Imperial, victim number 5, and still no investigation into Sowell, a known sex attacker. Sowell remained unsuspected by the authorities. Some police would later say that working the neighborhood itself can prove difficult. They're not always welcome, and crack-addicted women truly do disappear for weeks on end, and then return. But there was also Sowell's calm demeanor when he comes into contact with police, shown in the case of a woman who at one point in Sowell's story fell from a window at his home after being attacked, a story the entire neighborhood knew of.
12205 Imperial.
A passerby called in the incident. Indignant at the time it was taking to get help. As the neighbors of Sowell on Imperial Avenue watched, the passerby describes what he can see.
She looked like she around about 40.
About 40? All right.
Yeah.
Is she conscious?
She can't get up, though.
But she is awake, right?
Look, I ain't even trying to go near. I gave her my T-shirt to put on.
Is she awake?
She kind of awake and going in and out.
Breathing?
Yeah.
And which window did she fall out? The first or the second?
Oh, no.
Was it less than 6 feet or more than 6 feet?
Second, yeah, 12, 15
All right.
feet.
All right. There we go. And it happened just now, correct?
Yeah.
The case where the woman fell out the window, Anthony Sowell actually went to the hospital with that woman, and as the police were trying to question her, she was kind of afraid to say anything because he was there. You know, he told the police, well, we were just using drugs together, and she accidentally fell out of the window. You know, she later said that he was, attacking her.
Hers was not the only story of getting trapped by a man, raped, and who would escape only to be ignored by authorities. Once out of the house, the women recounted horrific stories.
The pattern seems to be that he's initially very charming and able to connect with women and lure them back to his house. But once he gets them back there, he begins to lose control. He begins to lose his temper. He begins to want to assert his power over them, his abuse over them. And that's where we see time and time again. He rapes, he binds, he murders. He rapes, he binds, he murders.
Sowell again remains free to attack.
Essentially, people like Anthony Sowell and other serial rapists that have since been discovered, they were smarter than the police. They were smarter than the community. They knew that these women, and the women probably knew in some ways too, that nobody would care.
Ironically, he saw women as people who should be perfect. They were not supposed to have flaws.
He hated the fact that they used drugs and would even say things to them about it, and he wanted to help them, but then he would also do it himself. So he definitely had this strange relationship where he would meet women who had drug problems. He would kind of entice them into his home, with the idea of drinking or using drugs. But then he would also try to be very caring. Well, let me get you some clothes. Let me feed you. You look like you need to eat.
Someone was telling me that, and it stands to reason. He said that when he has these dreams, when he meets these girls, some of the girls remind him of his girlfriend. And I asked you, was anything that they said or was anything that they did? And you said by the way their past, you said you asked them about why you out here on the street. I talked to them. Yeah, you talked to them. Yeah. Why you out here on the street? And you're a nice girl. Why don't you get some help?
Someone you're trying to help them. That's cool.
And then you said you get mad and they remind you of your girlfriend. I know. And then that's what happened.
So it's kind of these two personalities that people would describe seeing. He had at least one or two girlfriends at the time that we were able to hear from afterwards who talked about, the long conversations they would have and how, kind and introspective he could be. But then he could also be very violent if someone disagreed with him or didn't say the right things.
Meanwhile, the signs that a multiple murderer was at large were there for anyone to see or smell if they really investigated.
There are a number of reports of a bad smell being reported in the area.
Right next to the house where Anthony Sowell lived on Imperial Avenue was a place called Ray Sausage. And for years, when there had been foul odors that the neighbors noticed, they would call the city or call the health department. When people would come out, they would always attribute the smells to Ray Sausage. And in fact, the people that owned this very small family-owned sausage company redid their entire sewer system thinking that somehow the smell was being attributed to them, their sausage making, their dumpsters. We only realized later that it was probably Anthony Sowell. And in fact, the owner said at one point that they believed that he may have dumped some bodies in their dumpsters.
This fast food store became the focus of complaints. Surely the smell was coming from there. The owners took the issue seriously, spent tens of thousands of dollars digging up drains.
What we now know is that was the smell that was emanating from the decaying corpses that were in his home and buried in his garden.
But with 5 women dead and all having been seen last in Sowell's neighbourhood, that fact was still far from emerging. On January 17, 2009, Sowell was to strike again. As a child, Kim Wise Smith was close to her father. No trouble to her parents. When a teenager, Kim had begun sampling drugs, and when a young woman, she was hooked. After she disappears, her father offers a reward to help find her, but she was never to be seen alive again. Murdered by Sowell, her body buried in the garden. It took a DNA test from her father to confirm it was her. It was next the turn of Nancy Cobbs to become the focus of Anthony Sowell's gaze. Nancy Cobbs was, on her own admission, a very poor mother. But as she got older, so she got her life back in some sort of order, helping raise her grandchildren, but often being seen with a man, drinking beer on a stoop. That man was Sowell, and in April 2009, she disappeared. Friends and family combed the neighbourhood. They did not search the garden of 12205 Imperial. Imelda Hunter, known as Amy, by 14 she had become pregnant, her daughter born deaf and with cerebral palsy. Amy found solace in drugs, and by 2009 often sought both them and companionship in 12205 Imperial. She'd struck up a friendship with an assassin. How would Amy's story end? Inside the home of Anthony Sowell, Amy Hunter would have seen the clothes left abandoned after Sowell had claimed the lives of his victims. She may even have seen the remains of others left to decompose in rooms and inside barely concealed spaces. Certainly, she would have been overwhelmed by the stench of putrefying flesh. But, likely as not, heavily under the influence of drugs, she was powerless to either escape or avoid the same fate of the women whose bodies were all around her. She became victim number 9 of the Cleveland Strangler. Still no outcry in the neighbourhood as so many women went missing, and still no suspicion about Sowell, who'd actually become a popular fixture on Imperial Avenue.
He really had this kind of outward appearance to the neighborhood where he would hold barbecues and chat with people. They didn't really suspect him of doing anything like this.
Janice Webb liked a party, the joker according to her family. The same profile as the others, addicted to crack cocaine, often seen wandering the streets looking for a way of satisfying her lethal habit, falling under the spell of a man who by now was running out of space to store the bodies.
All I say is understand, that's all I So, hold up, let me see.
If you were in my shoes, what would you want me to tell you? 10, 9, 8, 7, 6.
I don't know.
He was literally leaving them at his feet. Some believe by this stage he had lost his mind.
The fact that he murdered 2 women and just left their bodies on the floor of his home with no attempt to conceal them really does suggest that there was some kind of underlying mental illness, potentially compounded by his drink and drug problems.
There's not just a sense that he's killing and neatly, tying everything up and moving along and trying not to do this again. There's a sense that this is who he is. This is his life. He's surrounded by his handiwork everywhere he turns.
Talicia Forston was just 31 and a mother of 3 by the time she had been captured by crack, Sowell's 10th victim. Her remains later found, buried in a garden. 8 weeks later, in September 2009, Diane Turner was to become victim number 11. Her fragmented family life meant not only that nobody reported her missing, even after her body was recovered from 12205, it would remain unclaimed, unrecognised in the city morgue for nearly a year.
You got 4 bodies up top. You got 1 body in the basement. There's no more room in the house for bodies. So you gotta go outside. This would make her most likely the last one.
Actually, sheriff's deputies visited his house, and he had to check in regularly as a sex offender. And I think the same week as these bodies were discovered, they had checked in on him at his home, and they had just never entered his home because that wasn't part of what they did. If they did, they probably would have noticed something amiss or smelled the foul odor that neighbors had been complaining about for years, but couldn't really pinpoint, where it was coming from.
The series of killings finally ended towards the end of October 2009. it was not because of any great detective work. Rather, it was because Sowell did not complete his usual routine of attack, rape and murder. A woman called Latundra Billups joined up with Sowell for them to jointly buy crack before returning to 12205. An officer finally investigates and discovers other allegations of rape against Sowell, and police on October 29th finally entered 12205 Imperial Avenue.
When police went back to Anthony Sowell's house to arrest him for the rape, they initially just kind of walked into the house, and when they went upstairs, they found the two bodies that were decomposing pretty much out in the open, or maybe just only slightly covered over. So then they decided they needed to go over the whole house from top to bottom. They cordoned off the house, the backyard, and when they started digging in the backyard, I think they actually used some special sensors and found that there were some bodies buried underneath there. So they unearthed a number of the bodies from the backyard.
Officers interviewing Sowell try to win his confidence, engage in small talk, at first about his grandchildren.
You got 4?
You got 4, man.
Yeah. They call you Papa or Grandpa? Yeah?
And
you love that, don't you?
No.
You do.
It's okay, no. But that's everybody call me that.
Yeah, that's the love for them. So I know that. You probably be skinning and grinning.
Yeah, yes he do.
Don't you? You don't be grinning when they be coming up to you?
Anthony Sowell had entered the macabre pantheon of serial killers known throughout the world, under police interrogation. Despite protesting that the voices in his head had something to do with the murders, he eventually gave in to the truth.
So this boy born on a street in this unassuming green house with cousins and a mother and a grandmother grows up to be the notorious Cleveland Strangler, known for his viciousness in attacking women.
He's killed at least 11 women, and the motive behind that would appear to be one of sexual gratification, but potentially also one of power and control, particularly when you look at the method that he most likely used to kill those women, which is strangulation.
And for the city of Cleveland, Sowell's crimes meant a period of reflection.
It was a sobering moment for Cleveland to realize that 11 citizens could go missing and nobody could make the connection that they were all in the same place, had all been killed by the same man.
For a while, 12205 was left standing, a reminder of Sowell's crimes, where artifacts of the women had been abandoned, clothing and jewellery and other things in the upstairs apartment of his home.
No justice! No peace! No justice! No peace! No justice! No peace! Say it! No justice! No peace! No justice!
People moved quickly to get control of the house so that they could knock it down. And, you know, within the year, the house was bulldozed and made into an empty lot. And there's been plans in the works for almost 5 years now to put some kind of memorial at that site. I think it left the whole community numb. You know, how could we let this happen? How could we let this happen?
Sowell was given the death penalty in 2011, a sentence not yet carried out.
He's on death row in Ohio. At a maximum security prison. He actually has a number of appeals in his case. You know, he's definitely appealing the sentence that could put him to death. The arguments basically are, you know, that the mitigating factors weren't really given to the jury enough. You know, they didn't know enough about the reasons that he committed the crime.
Anthony Sowell would claim he never had a chance. He says he witnessed women in authority, his mother and grandmother, physically abusing his female cousins, watched and then took part in rape as 11 years old. His perspective on women skewed, he would argue that he was destined to become a rapist and a killer. An Ohio jury and judge did not accept that as mitigation. His steady military record and, ironically, his time in prison proved that he knew how to behave. His house of horrors was evidence of a mind twisted, but Sowell was sane enough to know that he had denied a future to the most vulnerable women of the neighborhood. 12205 Imperial is no longer there, but it has given up its secrets, so the knowledge of what Sowell did will haunt Cleveland forever.